All right. I think we're getting in. All right. So we're gonna welcome everyone. The audience will start filtering in, and so we're gonna give it a couple minutes for everybody to get set. Feel free to play your favorite earworm in your head while we all get together here. So we're expecting a number of folks today in the audience, and so we're excited to do this live and to talk about ransomware with you all here shortly. So, and while you are coming in, there is a poll um, just to gauge where the audience is at with ransomware. So, feel free to fill that out. All right, we're live. We're going to give it a couple more minutes here. Feel free to go ahead and get settled in, get your favorite beverage of choice out and ready for the next hour or so, and fill out a poll for us. And we're going to start talking about ransomware here shortly. All right, thank you for those people filling out the poll. Welcome in. We're going to get started in another 20 seconds or so. So we won't keep you waiting for long. Go ahead and get settled in, fill out the poll, and there is an audience chat. So I invite you to go ahead and start filling out any questions or comments into the audience chat as you would like, and we will get to them as we talk. So another few seconds here. All right, it is 5 after. I say we go ahead and get started. So, thank you all for joining us this afternoon on the East Coast. My name is Zach Eikenberry, CEO, co founder of Hook Security, and I am your host, which means that you won't be hearing a lot from me. Instead, you'll be hearing from our two panelists who have agreed to talk about a both popular and misunderstood and unknown topic, ransomware. So, for National Cybersecurity Awareness Month, we said, what can we do to help those small businesses out there on what's actually a problem? What are things coming down the pipe towards them if they aren't experiencing them already? And we said, why don't we put together a couple or pull together a couple of experts on everything to do with cybersecurity for small businesses and ransomware? So, I have with me Shay and Encore. They'll be able to introduce themselves a little more fully here. But today's talk is going to be on ransomware and the impact beyond the payout. So we'll spend some time throughout the presentation. We have slides that we'll be going through to define ransomware, and we'll also be talking a little bit more about exactly uh, some of the stories around ransomware and what you can do to prepare your organizations for it. And so, um, without any further ado, we're going to get right into it. Like I said, I'm not going to be uh, speaking very long because we have a couple of awesome experts. So we have Encore, who is a senior managing director and global head of cyber risk. So he's got a lot in his background. He did send me his bio. He's a Big Ten guy like myself. I think Shay is also Big Ten. So I'm Purdue Boilermaker. Pretty excited about the number one preseason ranked basketball program coming up. And I don't even acknowledge football's existence. Who care? And then, of course, Shay, who is an expert on all things data privacy and beyond. And she helps with the AI group and is in-house counsel at GTC. So, what we're here today to talk about is ransomware. It's on the next slide here, and it's simply a threat that's looming out there. And I don't know what comes to mind when you all think of a threat and a threat to your business, but what what we mean by threat is something that at any point in time can become a reality, and it can become a harmful reality. A threat is something that's just right outside your door that is at any point in time could become a an issue you're going to have to deal with. And the reality is, and there's some statistics around this, the threat of ransomware is real and it's happening. It's happening every day to numbers of small businesses. And most small businesses are like, well, I don't really have anything that people want. I don't have anything that people could really do anything with. I don't know why they would bother with me when there's all sorts of Fortune 500 companies, etc. And the truth of the matter is, you do have something that matters to them. And at the end of the day, it's going to be financial resources. It's going to be their ability to demonstrate. We'll talk a little bit about some of the ransomware gangs. Their ability to demonstrate that they know what they're doing on the bad guy echelon and hierarchies, and they are coming for small businesses. That's the number one growing vector when it comes to ransomware, and Shay and Encore see it every day. So, with that said, I'm actually going to toss it over to Shay. And Shay, I'd love for you to give us a little more background on who you are, and then tell us a little bit why we're here and why you're passionate about this ransomware conversation.
Yes, my name is Shay Leach. I am a privacy, cybersecurity, and AI attorney at GTC Law Group. And I have been practicing in privacy and cybersecurity since I was a baby lawyer over a decade ago. And so I saw the whole ransomware evolution as it happened. I've done a lot of proactive incident response work, which includes a lot of ransomware incidents. And now the bulk of my practice focuses on proactive cybersecurity, including risk assessments and cybersecurity planning and things like that. So this topic is near and dear to my heart because I think that there are a lot of large organizations who have figured out the game here. There's a very influential cybersecurity report that's published every year. It's the Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report, and it found that fewer and fewer large organizations are actually paying the ransom to these ransomware threat actors because they have gotten their infrastructure together where they have their production, their online environment, and then they can hot swap another environment if they have a ransomware incident. And that other environment is air gapped. That threat actor did not get to the other environment. So they're just saying, no, we're not going to pay. We're just going to hot swap over to the other environment and we're good to go. Now, small and mid-sized businesses, that is not the case for them. And in fact, the Verizon report indicated that 88% of small business incidents, small and mid-sized business incidents involved ransomware. Now, to contrast that, only 39% of incidents for larger organizations involved ransomware attacks. Um, and according to that same report, the threat actors typically are getting into your system by a system intrusion like malware or hacking, for example, where they exploit a known software vulnerability, social engineering, where they get you to click on a link or something like that, or a basic web application attack. And so these are attack factors that in many cases only take one person not paying enough attention and clicking on a link or opening an attachment that looks like something that they were supposed to get, and the bad guys are in your system. And so that's why we're here. We could go to the next slide, please. So let's talk about some more stories from what I and Ankura have seen in our practice. We're going to talk about some real cases and the real world impact on our clients. So we can move to the next slide now. So the first one that I'd like to talk to you about was a Fortune 500 service provider. This entity was it was part of the very, very early wave of ransomware incidents. Think 2015, 2016, and they were a B2B company. And so many B2B companies think that they are not so susceptible to these kinds of incidents, or maybe the risk is lower because they don't host a lot of consumer data. But this company had a lot of information about its B2B customers. That data, you could tell by the forensics, the threat actor had moved across the network. You could tell that they would have been able to see all of this data as they planned their ransomware attack, but the logging was not sufficient to tell whether the data was exfiltrated or whether or what was accessed. And this company had hundreds of B2B contracts with varying notice obligations. And so I, as a junior lawyer, was tasked with going through one by one these contracts and figuring out, oh, this one says that we needed to notify within 24 hours. We blew that 2 weeks ago. Oh, this one says, 3 business days. Okay, that's good to know. And figuring all of that out. And the business disruption plus that whole exercise was just a complete nightmare for this company, because being unable to deliver means that they are unable to work with their clients. There was another multinational manufacturing company where I worked on an incident, and this one was much more recently, maybe a year or two ago. And in this case, their operational technology in factories on 2 continents and 3 different countries was completely out of commission for over a month. And then they were negotiating with the threat actor, but they paid the ransom and got the decryption key, and it did not work. And so they had to rebuild their entire systems. By the time we were helping them with that, it was months of only partial functionality and over a month of like basically operating at a standstill. And in the meantime, this company was publicly traded. They had SEC disclosures to make, and they had the European regulators on their back too, because there was information about EU data subjects involved. And so some of these that we're highlighting are larger organizations, but the same business disruption can certainly happen in smaller organizations, and often does when there is no offline air-gapped backup. Or, for example, like with that manufacturing client, when your operational technology, which is often much less secure than IT, if that is affected. So that's what I've seen in my practice. Ankura, what would you add?
Yeah, thanks, Shay, and great to talk to everybody today. Um, Again, yeah, just to kick off on this third example, right? Really on law firm. When I think about the types of data that clients have, law firms are one of the most important because they have data about all of their clients, right? So it's a very sought after industry when it comes to bad actors. And we didn't put this stat up there, but in another very prominent report, the IBM Cost of a Data Breach report, they say bad actors sit in your environment for 200 plus days at a time, and that's really what this use case is talking about, right? Where they were able to get into the environment and they dwelled and moved around in the environment for a period of time that allowed them to understand their network architecture and actually help them find their backups, right? In many cases, and Zach and Shay alluded to this, if you have your backups and they're offline and you can restore, you don't have to pay that ransomware. And that's where a lot of the larger companies are moving to. But in this scenario, the bad actors were able to discover where their backups were and actually delete them. So by the time they uh, executed their ransomware, and we're going to show an example of what that looks like, um, when they wanted to go back and get to their backups to actually restore and not pay the ransom, they weren't able to, right? And they had thought they had, bulletproof backups, right? They like, we had this in place, we're good to go, but it was still on the same network and part of the same environment, which means if the bad actors were in, and they were able to see them as well. So they were quietly deleting those backups so that the law firm could not recover on their own and would have to pay the ransomware or build from scratch, right? For them specifically, this law firm example, they had about 3 weeks of downtime, right? So you can imagine for a law firm with all kinds of cases, that's a lot of time down. And they actually reported that 2 of their major clients departed after this attack, right? And there's lots of additional studies. We don't have it all in here on the impact of security issues and customer trust, which again, we don't have in here, but there's a deterioration in trust. And what does that mean to your clients or your customers going forward? So really good examples here, and we're trying to just set the stage and talk about some real world examples. As Shay mentioned, this is not, some of these are larger companies, but the impact and how these things evolve are applicable to every industry and every size. So
yeah, I think I'd love to jump to the next slide here. What I'm hearing from you guys is that the bad guys, the bad actors, right? They really want to disrupt your business. Now, you might think with ransomware that, oh, they just want your money. Well, yes, but they're only going to get that payout that's proportionate to how much it hurts you. And it hurts you, the more it hurts you as a small business. And what we were sharing were these large organizations that had security budget, that had people in place, and they fell. And those doors were locked. If you're a small business with unlocked doors, they can really put the hurt to you. And it is a different type of threat than we've ever seen before, because they go all out and they'll research and they'll be patient, like you said, Encore. So love to dig into this example that you have here, because you even have a redacted slide, which makes it look pretty cool.
Yeah. Well, one thing before we move on to this slide to underscore your point, one of the things that we'll mention a little bit later on in this presentation is the tactic of double extortion. So Ankura mentioned that the threat actors move around in your environment and try to figure out what's going on there, maybe try to find your backups. Well, they're also trying to find your valuable data. One of the first things that they do when they get into your environment is they find a way to escalate their privileges so that they have the virtual keys to the kingdom and they can get into all of your systems. So they will give themselves administrative access. And then once they find your crown jewels, so to speak, they take them and they say, we have your crown jewels, give us money or we won't give them back. And if you say, oh, well, we have backup crown jewels, they're just in a safe over here, we're good to go, they'll say, okay, well, we're going to just dump these all out on online and embarrass you with them. And then that's how they get a lot of other companies to pay, even if you have good backups.
Yeah, thanks, Zach. That's great, and it's a great segue to this slide and to the kind of quote on the left. I don't think anyone on this call and anyone I know in the cyberspace will say that you're 100% secure. That's just not the world we live in, right? We live in a digital ecosystem that's constantly evolving. So it's not about, if you're going to get hacked, it's when. And everything we are talking about today is about risk management, right? We're not expecting everything to be perfect within an organization, but how do you actually manage the most important stuff, right? The critical assets, the critical data. And also, just going back to the poll here, I saw everyone has experienced or heard of at least ransomware, which is great. So it's not a new concept to the folks on the call. And what we're showing on this slide right here on the right-hand side is an actual ransomware node, right? So an employee opens up their computer, and this is kind of what they see, because their computer's turned into a brick now, right? And you can't use it. And this note, and I know it's a little bit hard to see, is really saying a couple things. One, that you've been hit, all your data is breached. It's also saying that, as Shay was mentioning, we've stolen a bunch of your data, right? And we're going to use that as part of this extortion. And then it also talks about, what's going to happen next and how to contact them. The number one thing I always tell people, and we see this a lots of time, is, people see this and they want to actually start negotiating with their bad actor. That's a no-no, right? You should wait for the professionals, the legal partners, your incident response partners to help you with that, right? Because as soon as you start negotiating with them, the clock starts in their mind, right? Meaning you've seen this and now, hey, they're expecting payment in 2 days. that 48 hours has started, right? So you want to be able to plan and prep a little bit before you actually start getting engaged with them. But this is a real live example of an actual ransomware note. And I will say, because they even put it here in this, I think, third section here, that they do operate like a business, right? They want you to, if you do pay, they want you to get the decryption keys and actually get back up and running, because that makes them more reputable, right? If I pay but nothing works, and then they go to Shay's company and they ask them to pay, they're not going to pay, because why would they, right? So they want to operate, professionally and like a business, and they have help desk lines and things like this, which is pretty crazy. We're not going to get into all that right now, but they actually do operate like a business, and that's really what I wanted to highlight here as part of this example. And then if we go to the next slide, I just want to spend a minute on what I call kind of hidden risks and considerations, right? I think a lot of people think about ransomware and think about, oh, I got to pay that ransom. That's a big number, whatever that number may be, right? But there's a lot of other stuff that is part of the equation when it comes to the risks that you may endure or the effects you may endure from a ransomware, right? I'm not going to read every bullet here, but we covered some of these already, right? Loss of downtime, right? Depending on what business you are, say you're manufacturing, that's really big, right? If you can't produce your product for a week or however long that is, that's a big financial impact, right? And a business impact. The actual time it takes to get back up and running, whatever that may be, right? Both money, time, and resources. Loss and damage to customer relationships. So I mentioned that earlier, right? There's a lot of studies on, if customers want to work with a company that have had a breach, or if they stay with a company that has had a breach, a security breach that includes their information, right? We could do a poll right now, and I bet most people will say that they have had some type of legal outreach, right, for class action lawsuits against companies that have had incidents. I know I get them, I feel like, all the time. Hey, your data was part of an incident. Do you want to be part of this class action lawsuit, right? So again, there's lots of things that happen. Also, I kind of think of this as the tip of the iceberg. We think about a little bit at the top, but there's a lot of other downstream effects of these types of incidents that everyone should just be aware of, because this all comes into play when we think about best practices and how do we plan and prepare better.
Yeah, Shay, why don't we now that we've kind of put our head around some of this ransomware, I'd love for you, because this is one of your hills, right? Which is the perception of who these bad actors are and what's going on in the threat landscape.
Yes.
I'd love to jump into that part. I'd love to, because I have a similar passion, but I'd love to hear what yours is around the perception and the reality of these bad actors and why they're doing all this business disruption that we just talked about.
Sure. Yeah. Let's talk about the threat landscape. If we could move to the next slide, you will see the ubiquitous hoodie guy that is always in every single cybersecurity presentation that you will ever see or have ever seen in your natural life. Some people think that he's a highly sophisticated loner. Some people view him as like a loser in his mom's basement. And, he's just off there wreaking havoc against, Fortune 500 companies and small businesses alike. But in reality, what you're looking at is what's on the next slide. They are these organizations that are that operate as a business, like Ankura mentioned. So this article that I found in the Times of London really highlights the reality of the situation, because in most cases, these are individuals who are operating in countries without extradition treaties with the United States, for example, because the United States works with all kinds of countries, and most countries do have extradition treaties with us. And you better believe our FBI, as you see on the left there, will go after cyber criminals if they are wreaking havoc out there in the market. And so we could start with the guy on the left. That is an FBI wanted poster for Igor Olegovich Toroshev, I believe is his name. He was the mastermind behind the Drydex malware, which was a banking Trojan from years ago that's still in use, actually. And it's designed to steal credentials. So a threat actor will get into your environment, probably through a phishing email or something like that. And this Dridex software, malware, is loaded, and it's quietly collecting credentials in the background and logging your keystrokes. So he's wanted by the FBI, but he's in Russia, and so the FBI is probably not going to get him. And the guy in the center there, you see Maxim Yakubets. He is one of the ringleaders of what they call Evil Corp. Evil Corp is a state-sponsored organization. We believe they're sponsored by Russia and the United States. And their early tactics involved mostly deploying things like Dridex to commit banking fraud, but then they pivoted to ransomware, and they never went back. The trouble with these kinds of actors is that they are highly sophisticated, but they are business people too, and so they operate as a business. It's ransomware as a service is what it's called, and they operate as a criminal enterprise that has a helpful support desk if you are having trouble with that decryption key, for example. So what I'd really like people to do is to stop picturing the loner in the hoodie and start picturing the Eastern European guy in a tracksuit with a Lamborghini, because that would be more accurate.
And just to add to that point, as an example, for those who don't know, in Russia, where many of these ransomware groups live and operate, their policy is, if you want to live and work in Russia and do this to other countries, that's okay, as long as you don't attack Russian companies or citizens, right? So that's their policy. It's very widely known. Do whatever you want. We're not going to come down on you, as long as you don't come after your own country and citizens. And that's why it's really hard for us to actually go after them. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's basically the same with China as well. And then
Right.
sometimes the countries will be attempting to operate with plausible deniability, so they won't, these actors will look like they're independent, but they do often get state funding in some way.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that's pretty important because we didn't really talk about the hierarchy of scams, right? And like the text message scams you guys get around like paying tolls, or I got one about Robinhood today. There's these different scams have different backers, have different organizational structures to them, and they have different long-term goals, right? And so there are places, in every part of the world where people are using online, the internet, and its anonymity to their benefit, and they're going after folks. But what we're talking about with ransomware is both a level of sophistication, and we'll talk about. Go ahead and hit the next slide, Ethan. We're talking about a level of sophistication here that historically was just for large nation states. And what we're seeing is even these large organizations in Russia or China or wherever that they're sponsored are starting to go downstream. And you're starting to see them go after the local bank and the local law firm. And you're starting to see them go beyond just, government services, Fortune 500 infrastructure. You're starting to see them go down. And I think part of that reason is right here. And I don't know if Ankura or Shay, who's taking on the ransomware as a service, but I think this is really powerful to realize that these things are just project managed, and there are
Yeah.
people that take every step along the way.
I could jump in first, and one of the things that you said made me want to underscore something that Ankura said earlier, which was don't just start negotiating, because one of the things that you mentioned, Zach, that is really important to understand is that depending on who the threat actor is. They have different motivations. And what you'll often do is, once you bring in a forensic firm, they might have the ability to negotiate, or you might bring in somebody who specializes in ransomware negotiations. And having done so many of these, they understand the various threat actors. They understand what kind of offer you can make them that might offend them, whereas what kind of offer they might entertain. And they'll understand, they'll help you to get a good idea of who you're dealing with as well. And so one of the things that I just thought was important to note here, with respect to ransomware as a service, is that it really does democratize the ransomware landscape. You can operate as a cog in one of these, in one of these silos in the ransomware, in the ransomware hierarchy, and you still get a little bit of the cut. At one point, ransomware threat actors were highly sophisticated, pretty much all of them, but that is not the case anymore. The rise of ransomware as a service, relatively unsophisticated actors can get in on the ransomware game. Hey, Ankura, do you want to walk us through the ransomware org chart here?
Yeah, sure. And this is not all encompassing, but it captures some of the big types of players that are in this ecosystem, right? So I'll just cover off a couple of these for a few minutes, as there's a lot, well, there's something to go through. But there's a malware developer, right? Someone that's kind of behind the keyboard, actually developing the malware that's going to be used, and then they can sell that off, right? There's the initial access broker. So think of this as someone that would do a lot of phishing campaigns and actually try to harvest credentials in some way, shape, or form, right? So they have been able to get access to a company and say, okay, now I got the keys. Now I'm going to sell these to someone else to do whatever they want to do, right? There's the affiliates. So those are the types of organizations that are actually buying these different parts together and using them to actually deploy whatever their attack is, right? There's a cryptor. So this is the technology that's used to mask ransomware. So, many cases, these types of attacks are easily detectable. So cryptors are used to help obfuscate that, so it's not as easily detectable, right? There's the call center negotiator, and actually that should just be call center in general, right? Because as we were talking about before, they do actually have a call center that you can work with in most cases to help with the decryption process, but also there's someone that's there that will negotiate with you, right? Now, where it gets tricky, and I'll just mention this as going back to an earlier war story, the more data they have access to, the harder it is to negotiate. We have lots of examples where, I know I think of one in particular where they had access to the insurance policy, and the insurance policy said, yeah, you have, I'll just say $1 million in ransomware payment. So they wouldn't negotiate or underneath that $1 million because they knew it was covered by insurance, right? So again, the more data they have access to, the more dangerous they can be, right? And then the crypto mixer, right? This is used by attackers to basically launder their cryptocurrency and hide ransomware payments. So think of it as money laundering almost, right, for cryptocurrency. So again, these are just some of the kind of big components that fall into this. But the point of this being, it's democratized to the point where you don't need to be an expert in all components of ransomware. You can buy the services and deploy them as needed against your victim. So again, it just makes this threat more and more prevalent for everybody across the world because of how easy it is to do this. So as we think about that, and if we can move to the next slide, I just want to cover a little about evolving attacks, right? And 4 of them that we had kind of listed here, which we kind of covered in a minute for already in a little bit. But top left, right, dual extortion. We talked about this, and Shay mentioned this at the beginning, right? It's not just deploying a ransomware and asking for a ransom because your systems don't work. It's now also, hey, we also stole your data. And we're not just going to ransom you to get your systems back up and running. We're also going to ransom you for another amount that we don't release your confidential data. That could be customer information. That could be sensitive information about your clients. That could be proprietary information, depending on what you do, right? So that double extortion now exists. And that's actually moved into the triple extortion field now, where we've actually seen on our side some of those attacks have gone to the physical world, and they said, hey, if you don't pay these ransomwares, we're going to have a gang, come to your house, et cetera, right? So it gets kind of scary, from that perspective. The bottom left, we just covered. That's the ransomware as a service model. Again, just really making it more accessible to people that want to get into this field. Top right, AI powered, right? We had to touch on AI at least for a minute. But everything that we do now is AI powered. And it's also true for the cyber criminals, right? So the easiest thing to think about is, phishing emails. In the past, you could identify them with, misspellings, grammar issues, things like that. Now they can pump that through an AI system and it looks perfect, right? Perfect English, perfectly coded, perfectly, developed to look like exactly like the email you get from Microsoft to reset your password, right? We've also seen it in the form of deep fakes, right? I'm sure many of you have heard about the different types of deep fake scams that are out there where they're acting like a deep fake the CFO of a company to ask for a wire fraud payment, things like that, right? So there's a lot of other examples. I'm just going to cover that, but AI has definitely helped enhance how they can attack and how they can target, organizations and individuals. And then also supply chain. One of the biggest growing areas from a threat perspective is third-party risk and supply chain risk, right? Think about all the partners or providers you work with, and think about the data that they may or may not have access to, right? Um, if you think about a law firm or professional service firm like us, we have access to a lot of client information, right? So if I can get access to that one organization, say a law firm, a professional services firm, think about an MSP, an IT MSP. If I get access to them, I now may have access to their thousands of clients downstream, right? So that supply chain component is an extrapolation event for bad actors. They get access to that type of company. And we've seen that with different tool sets, right, that exist nowadays. Look at MoveIt, for example, the SaaS software that was out that happened last year, right? That was considered a supply chain attack because that allowed them access to all their clients' information. So that's a big one that's rising nowadays, where they're specifically targeting companies that have treasure troves of information because it just extrapolates what they can do with that data and how they can, ransomware individuals and or companies.
Yeah, one of the interesting ones that we've seen, and we mentioned law firm attacks. Some of the law firm attacks, some of the more prominent ones that we've seen, have seemed to be motivated by the desire to get access to non-public information and then trade on that information and make money in the stock exchange, because law firms have information about corporate transactions that may not be public. So it really depends on that threat actor group. And another evolving tactic that we have been hearing a lot more about and seeing more in incidents is fileless ransomware. Ransomware that once it's initially let in the door, usually through phishing or something like that, or maybe you clicked on a malicious link, it operates exclusively in memory. So your traditional event detection and response kind of software won't pick it up because it's running exclusively in memory. And so the tactics are evolving.
Yeah, absolutely. The other example, and then I'll move forward to Shay's exact point. We do a lot of work with like private equity. Every time a deal is announced in private equity, that target and the private equity company has an increased number of attacks, right? Because they're trying to get access to that information and to act on that information. So another example of where public information can lead to an increase in bad actor activity against you, right? So as we think about that, and on the next slide, we want to think about, well, how can we fortify ourselves better, right? What I focus on, what Shay focuses on a lot of our time is how do we help our clients protect themselves so that hopefully, if something does happen, it's not as bad as it could be, right? And as we jump into that, I want to talk about some of the common exploitations for SMB specifically, right? As Shay mentioned at the beginning and on the next slide, 88% of SMBs have the ransomware attack, and there's a reason why they are targeting SMBs. And there's 5 that we want to kind of highlight here, right? I'm not saying these are all things you can solve tomorrow, right? But it's things to be aware of, to think about how you build your roadmap and support your posture in terms of your development of your cyber program, right? Um, Limited resources and expertise, right? Many SMBs, and again, very, very different for every company, operate with small or non-existent IT and security teams, right? So it's really hard to implement robust security and or respond to security events. Just as importantly, right? The time to respond to event is just as important in how you respond to it. Lack of employee training, right? And obviously, this is something that Hook Security focuses on: is how do we train our people to identify these types of attacks and stop them in their tracks, right? The human element in every cyber report you read, the human element is still the number one way people get access to organizations, right? Different types of scams, phishing, phishing, so forth and so on, right? It's different types of social engineering. So how do we train them better to actually minimize or maximize their effectiveness in identifying those attacks and stopping them before they go further, right? Um, Weak access controls, right? At the center of security is identity management, right? How do we manage access to data? Who has access to that data? When can they access that? And is that appropriate, right? And part of that is using strong access controls. Many SMBs that we've seen we work with don't have strong access controls, including things like multi-factor authentication, right? That code you get, to your cell phone or whatever it might be. And what we've seen here is if you just employ that, especially on your sensitive data assets, that can make a big difference in deterring bad actors, right? Bad actors, especially ransomware actors, are looking for the low hanging fruit, right? How can I do this quickly and make my money? So if they're deterred, that will make them move on to something else. I'm not saying it's an end all be all and will solve everything, but it definitely makes a difference, right? Um, the rise of remote work, right? I don't think anyone has not thought about this one, right? How has the expansion of where our teams sit and where they work from changed our cyber and IT landscape? And because of that, we have a bigger digital footprint we have to work with from an organizational perspective, right? Individuals working from their home networks that may be unsecured, working from public Wi-Fi's, things like that. That becomes really important. And there is, in that same IBM report I mentioned earlier, I think it's a $1 million increase in the cost of a breach when it originates from a remote work destination, someone's house or someone's phone, right? So that's an important component to it as well. And then lastly, unpatched assets. I can't stress the importance of this one, right? Just vulnerable technology that hasn't been patched properly, it hasn't been updated. Legacy systems, as an example. We go into so many organizations where they don't have a good patching culture or enhancement culture. Think about, Microsoft Patch Tuesdays. Are you actually applying those things? Bad actors will sit on the public internet and just scan for unpatched assets and seeing if they can get into them via those vulnerabilities, right? So that's a very easy kind of low hanging fruit from my perspective. I know it's more entailed than that, but highlighting that and we see it a lot of SMBs is really important because that can be solved fairly easily. I'm not saying these are the only 5 things to be on the lookout for, but these are the ones that kind of rise to the top, especially for the SMB industry.
Yeah, and when you talk about unpatched assets, it's worth also going back and highlighting that operational technology that I mentioned when
Yep.
we talked about the manufacturer data breach, because oftentimes that OT tends to be maybe partially legacy systems, or it's not as secure as your IT. Maybe it's a little bit older, but it's still connected to your network. And so that can be a vulnerability that can leave an entry point for a threat actor.
Yep.
Something we didn't really touch on very much, which is part of the human nature of these bad actors, is they're fundamentally lazy, right? And so part of the reason you even see them create these segregation of duties and create these org charts is because they just want to specialize in one thing. They want to they want to become an expert in something that they can do the least amount of work and get the most reward for, right? And so one of the things I think is very interesting because I actually love this list because the opposite of these exploitations is a real strong security fundamental is that if you were to simply do these 5 things or the opposite of them, you would make yourself a difficult enough target that frankly they might just move on and find someone else. And that sometimes is your best protection. Is if you're trying to outrun a bear, you don't have to worry about the bear. You just have to worry about the slow person next to you, right? Outrunning your buddy. And I don't mean to speak too, I don't know, brazenly about it, but I do think that's one of the things that sometimes when it comes to security, it's a relative game. And your security just needs to be relatively tighter than other folks. And we want everybody to have better security. But the fact of the matter is, as a small business in 2025, 2026, you got to lean in and add resources. You got to train. You got to know your access points. You got to know who's working where, and you got to patch your systems, right? That's just the reality.
Yeah, and unfortunately, right, especially in the SMB space, and I bet Shay will agree with this, right? We're working with clients after they've been hit, right? Once they get hit in the mouth, right? They're like, oh man, I gotta do some stuff. But really, the whole point of this and all of Cybersecurity Awareness Month, October, is to understand that you really need to take a proactive approach, right? This is not a sit back and wait and see and hope things go okay. This is a, hey, we need to make sure we are preparing and protecting ourselves so that we can manage this if it happens, and hopefully it does not happen. So I'll go to the next slide and pass it to Shay because it's a perfect segue into how we think about protecting ourselves and preparing ourselves against these types of attacks.
And as we go to this, because there's a couple of slides after this I really want to get to as well,
Yeah.
maybe we can highlight one or two things on here, like what is your bugaboo? What's the thing that you would say, hey, all these things are important. Get this one done.
Okay, yes, I can hone in on a few of these because they're very important. First of all, you see, upper left-hand corner here on your screen, the cybersecurity risk assessments. Do them. Align your organization to some kind of industry framework. You've got NIST CSF, you've got the CSC top critical security controls, you've got ISO if you're a larger organization potentially, and just start assessing your cybersecurity posture. At the beginning, your scores aren't going to be amazing, but once you do the assessment, it will help you to put together a prioritized roadmap to strengthen those defenses. And one of the things that I always like to point out is that you really need to bring in an outside vendor to do your security assessment, an outside technical vendor, and it's also advisable to conduct these at the direction of counsel. If an incident occurs, lawsuits often arise and regulatory enforcement actions. And you better believe that Exhibit 1 that plaintiffs' counsel will want is your cybersecurity risk assessment so that they can know where all of the bodies are buried. If engaged properly, you can set it up so that your cybersecurity risk assessment is to enable counsel to tell you if you are meeting your legal and regulatory obligations with respect to your cybersecurity. And if that's the case, it'll be a lot harder for those plaintiffs or regulators to get their hands on that report. Also, the bit about bringing in an external security vendor is really important, because if they get their hands on that report, or if in interrogatories they find out that your internal security team conducted the risk assessment, they're just going to say that the fox was guarding the henhouse. You mean the same people who are responsible for implementing this security program are telling us how amazing it is? It just doesn't look very credible. So that is a huge one. And then you do your incident response planning and tabletop exercises. So if you have a shiny incident response plan and you set it on your shelf, it's no good to you. Everybody needs to know their roles and responsibilities. They need to know, who's responsible for what, and they need an offline copy, because I don't know how many ransomware incidents I've seen where you say, do you have an incident response plan? Yes. Oh, awesome. Great. What does it say? Who is responsible for what? I don't know. It's on the system and it's locked down. Okay, you might as well not even have one. And so those are really big, huge tips that I would give. The other ones that I would emphasize are training. They say about 60% of incidents have some kind of human element where somebody opens the door for the bad guys. MFA, that's basically been um, determined like as like common law, reasonable security, all of the cybersecurity frameworks, any regulation is going to say you need it. So if you don't have it, it's going to be looked at as negligent. And your policies and procedures. Shiny tools do not a security program make. Need policies and procedures. Those are your organizational safeguards. So I just crammed a lot in there. Anything to add, Encore?
No, I think, yeah, without spending too much more time, yeah, I think it's important. And just, top right pen testing, but just in general, test yourself, right? Try ethical hacking, do things that the bad actors do to see if there are holes. Because again, that's the easiest way to kind of validate and actually potentially fix those things before it becomes something more relevant by a bad actor, right? But I know we'll move forward. I know we have a few more slides left and we've got a few minutes left. So one thing I wanted to highlight, and I mentioned this from a third-party risk perspective, is vendor security questionnaires. So I'm sure everyone works with a variety of vendors for a variety of reasons, right? And what's important about them is how do you categorize them in terms of criticality, and that depends on what they do, the type of access they have, the data they're using, et cetera, right? But what we have listed here is just a sample. This is not everything you want to ask, but a sample of some of the questions that are really important when you think about who you're working with and how are they managing and securing the data that you are sharing with them that they have access to, right? Do they have proper protocols? Do they have encryption? Do they have incident response plan in place? Do they have cyber liability, which we're going to talk about in a minute? Do they do their own kind of testing, right? It's really important because, as we mentioned, there's such a rise in third-party risk that you understand what vendors you have, what they have access to, and how are they actually going to protect you and themselves when it comes to cyber threats, right now in the market, right? And as we talk about cyber liability, we'll move to the next slide and we'll spend a minute on that with Shay.
Yeah. So cyber liability insurance is a place where a lot of companies get tripped up. As you may have seen with your run-of-the-mill health insurance, there are all kinds of policy exclusions in network, out of network, those kinds of things. You can see a lot of those types of issues pop up in the cyber insurance space as well. Um, Now, many policies these days have high deductibles. They call it your retention that you have to pay out of pocket before any of their coverage will kick in. Sometimes it can be $25 to $100,000, and so if you are taking on a policy with significant premiums and a pretty high retention, you want to be sure about what you're getting. And some of the common policy exclusions that surprise people that we see are exclusions for social engineering. So, for example, your secretary or somebody in finance gets a phishing email that appears just like it came from a CFO with new wire instructions, and they say wire money to this bank account. Well, under a lot of policies, that won't even be covered because it's social engineering, and they'll basically say that it was your employee's fault, so we won't cover it. Um, Ransom payments are sometimes excluded. I've seen plenty of policies where they are included, but um, there was a time 3 to 5 years ago where the ransom payments were getting so huge that this became a more common policy exclusion. And so that's one to watch out for. And in any event, your policy will probably cap the amount that they are willing to pay for that or for that ransom payment, as Encore alluded to with the bad guys who got access to the law firms cyber policy.
Yeah, if I may jump in, I want to make sure we hit the last slide or next slide on best practices. So I think I don't want to discount anything on the insurance, but one takeaway is if you think your insurance is going to save you, it's not, right?
Yeah.
And so it's not a safety blanket that it once was for organizations, because insurance providers think about this all the time and they're not going out of business. So they're going to work with people. But I would love in just the last couple minutes here, Shay, start with you, and then to Encore. If you had just like one takeaway, it's like, hey, I want you all to. This is my one takeaway when it comes to the topic of ransomware. If you could spend 60 seconds telling us what that is, that would be awesome.
Yeah, I think that what all of this boils down to, and we've got some, tips here are like top 10-ish security controls that we recommend. But I think what it really boils down to is creating a culture of cybersecurity in your organization that goes to the training and things like that. A lot of employees think that cybersecurity is not within their remit, but every employee needs to understand that cybersecurity is part of their job responsibilities. And then once cybersecurity is part of your corporate culture, you start checking off these boxes a lot easier. You start doing those risk assessments, you start making sure you have your policies, testing your tabletop exercise, etc. Can we upgrade our tools? Can we just allocate a little bit more budget? And so you start thinking about those questions, and then you create that culture. But that has to come top down, not bottom up. Encore, what would you say?
Yeah, yeah, and just to add to that, and I'll give my thoughts as well in the last minute here. We always say, right? People used to think of cyber as an IT issue. It's absolutely not anymore, right? It is a business top level issue. If you look at every kind of CEO analyst report, cybersecurity is in the top 3 risks that they think about for their business across the globe, right? So we need everyone to be thinking about it, from that perspective, and then tying back to kind of a takeaway, right? As Shay already mentioned around strong culture and things of that nature, but also it needs to be an ongoing culture, an ongoing risk management process, because cyber is not a let me implement a project or a tool and I'm done, right? Threats are always evolving. Look at AI, right? Our businesses are always changing. So it's really important that you constantly evaluate that risk and then adjust your plan to meet that risk, right? What you thought 6 months ago or a year ago may be very different than what it is now because of the evolving threats and because of your business, right? You could be implementing new business services or customer services or things like that. So just really important to think of this as an ongoing thing. It's not a point in time. And that will really help keep you up to date in terms of how to manage cyber risk.
Man, this has been awesome. I've learned a lot, and you got the juices going right now when it comes to what I could be doing, even inside my own organization that's a security organization. So I really appreciate it, you guys. Both of you, you are clearly experts at this, and I appreciate your time and jumping in with us during Cyber Security Awareness Month. So, if you're in the audience, feel free to tag them directly. Shay and Angor, you can find them on LinkedIn. We'll pass out to anybody who showed up and gave us their email, their contact information for anything you might need in the future. So,
Yeah, please feel free to reach out with any questions.
awesome.
Thank
All
you,
right.
everybody. Appreciate it.
Have a great day. See you all. Thanks.